right.
And yes, we are live. So, welcome everyone who's watching, and welcome James. So today we are at episode 9 so far of these chats, which is really cool. And we're going to talk about, well, a bunch of things. We already started before the live kicked off, so we know we have a bunch of stuff to talk about. But primarily, it's going to be about damage to weapons and armor in history, like battle damage, how we can kind of interpret it and, well, probably also identify it, I suppose, interpret it and what it can tell us more about weapons, but also probably what it can tell us about maybe modern practice and these kinds of things. So, of course, as with many things that are sword and weapons and history related, not everything is written in stone. But what's written in paper, at least, is probably written by James Hester. So, on this, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you. So, God, where do we even begin? So, I took a very scenic route into playing with swords professionally. I started out at about the age of 15 doing stage combat stuff for the Renaissance Festival circuit in New England, in the northeast US, for those who know Renaissance festivals. So I started originally doing stage combat and theatrical stuff. And this was in the mid to late 90s when this whole idea of what was then a lot of times called Western martial arts was starting to kind of gradually pick up. This was still the kind of prehistoric days where people were working off of really bad Xerox copies of the few treatises that were kicking around and that were being spread around. This is like really big internet communities for this stuff. And through working the Ren fairs, I ended up hanging out with some of the early movers and shakers in my area who were trying to do the more historical stuff. And so I got involved with that. And then moved to England to do a master's, which was my official motive, but my ulterior motive was to inject myself into the Royal Armouries up in Leeds as effectively as possible to try to get in with their interpreters department, which was my dream job at the time. And so I spent some time with them, but the dream gig never materialized, but I was just determined to plant myself in the armories and not go away until something happened, which I did. I worked in the galleries for a little bit, kind of yelling at people not to touch the armor and that sort of stuff. And then lo and behold, a job came up in the curatorial department as a researcher. And I made my way into that, made my way up eventually into the curatorial assistant and or assistant curator, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and then ended my time at the Armories taking care of their collection down at the Tower of London, which was amazing, both the collection and the site.
Yes.
And then after a brief return back to the US for a few years due to visa-related gubbins, where I did some independent research. That's where I worked with Jeffrey Forgang for his new edition of 133. I helped him write the introduction for that, and because I also do some work with manuscripts and paleography, so we worked together on that a bit. And then in 2015, because it was the 600th anniversary of Agincourt, I saw an advert that the University of Southampton was offering a scholarship for someone doing something related to medieval military history. And so I thought about an idea that me and the Edge Weapons curator at Leeds had kind of batted around for a while as possibly a research project, which was looking at what appeared to be damage to weapons and armor from usage, not just from things being damaged in storage. and trying to look at this stuff more closely because no one really had in any meaningful way up to that point, and see what we can learn from it. And so I applied. I jazzed it up a little bit more into a more well-rounded PhD-worthy proposal, and fools, they accepted it, and that allowed me to head back to Britain, even to work with some of my old colleagues, because the PhD was funded by what was called the Arms and Armour Heritage Trust, which is a charitable endeavor kind of in the same orbit as the Armory and some of the other arms and armor scene in the UK. And they funded me to spend 3 years doing this project, which I can go into in more detail if you want. But as far as a kind of Cliff Notes introduction, that's
I mean, I think we will be going for sure into more detail.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting path. It feels like yours, as for a lot of people I'm seeing that are kind of involved in this world, it's a little bit of luck, a little bit of like hard-headed seeing a goal and kind of, yeah, exactly, just moving towards it.
Yep.
And oftentimes that seems to blend really well into a certain amount of satisfaction and cool activities and things on. I suppose England is also a really dynamic, or like a really rich environment for this kind of study, because
Oh yeah. I mean, it's part of the reason I wanted to do my master's in England, is I wanted to study medieval history that actually had a Middle Ages. I mean, not to say that there aren't wonderful programs in the US and such, but so I went to York for my degree, and studying medieval history in a town like York. I don't know if you've ever been, but it's
I haven't.
Extraordinary. It is a beautifully, unapologetically medieval city. There's no place finer for doing work like that.
Yeah, I think when you're lucky enough to be able to walk medieval streets and see what you're like reading about or something, that's just a little extra flavor on the recipe. You are in France though now, so do you notice any big differences, let's say, between, as far as you know, at least, like between the because of course, there's a lot of the fact that it's so visible is that it's in English with England, so a lot of their content and information is easily available, but there are even big cultural differences, at least for me coming from Italy, I do notice them. So do you see big like local philosophies in terms of how medieval heritage is dealt with or promoted, or?
Tricky. I mean,
yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot.
I haven't. No. I mean, I haven't. I can't say I've been here long enough to get a real taste of the scene, because I only moved here the last August. So quite a bit of that was putting down roots, dealing with the mountain of administrative stuff that is involved with existing in France if you're a foreigner, or even if you're not a foreigner. But the little bits that I've seen, and through prior experience, through research trips and things, I'd say there are some differences. I mean, certainly the way that the personnel taking care of the heritage scene is organized. Again, we talked about this a little bit before we went live. You know, I would have struggled to do what I did if I was living here for that entire period, because here, if you want to go into at least some higher levels jobs in the heritage world and the museum world, you have to pass the concours, which is a competitive exam that is quite multidisciplinary. So if even if you're a weapons specialist, you're going to expect to field questions on this exam of everything ranging from Greek pottery to impressionist paintings and everything in between. So it's a very kind of broad shop that you have to demonstrate at least a baseline of knowledge in. And so it's so once you get over that hump, the staff are very professional, and it's very well organized as far as, staffing them. That's not to say people, peasants like me who haven't passed that exam can't get involved, but it's just, if I wanted to be the same position that I was in England, I'd have to go through that process. So it's a lot more regimented here. I would say, definitely. Like, I managed to make it into the armories with a master's degree at the time, and a lot of kind of amateur prior experience that was relevant, and just kind of slowly, got to know people who trusted me and knew me, and then, trusted me in these positions. So it's, I could get away with that more in England, and, probably similarly in the US. But if I wanted to do that here, no. There's a process.
Yeah, it reminds me quite a bit of Italy, and it's just different ways of approaching things. But sometimes I see like things how they work in the UK have a bit of a breath of fresh air approach to them. I just remember one example, I think, that stood out to me, was that TV show where they do the archaeological digs. I don't remember, it's Time.
Is it Time Team?
Yes, Time Team.
Time Team,
and just the way they, like, how quickly they can make a TV and entertainment out of something that is really nerdy, and a lot of people you would imagine would have no interest in. And it would be nice to see that kind of enthusiasm and that way of bringing things even in other countries. Like, me coming from Italy, I'd love to see that kind of approach, for example, in a TV show back home.
Where in my so far very limited experience here in France, where I've seen a lot of that is from some of the more independently owned sites, because you have the Patrimoine, which is the kind of state-managed historic sites, and these are your big, iconic places. But you've also got lots and lots of sites that are still privately owned through families. And it's funny, I just had an experience about this a couple of weeks ago over the Easter break. There's a small chateau ruin, maybe about a 10-minute drive from where I am, that normally is not open to the public, but there was a special event over the Easter break where they had some medieval crafts people on site demonstrating crafts. And so we thought, it's like, there's nothing else to do. The kids are on break. Let's go check it out. This is not far. And, it's this beautiful ruined, I think 13th, 14th century chateau that was basically, long story short, when the more iconic chateau in the next town over called Udon was built, the Duke of Brittany decided two chateaus so close together aren't really necessary, so they basically cannibalized the older one to build the new one. And so this ruin now has been in this family for, a number of centuries, like, old landed aristocratic family. And I ended up, by pure chance, meeting the owner, who was wandering around the site asking people wanted a tour. And I said, "Oh, I'm a medieval historian. Yeah, I'd love a tour." And he was like, "You're a medieval historian?" And he glommed onto me and nerded out for a couple of hours. And we had these wonderful conversations and exchanged details. And he's got the bug. He's very passionate about his site, and he wants to learn about it. And he's, really happy to talk to people who are equally passionate. And it's not to say that he's not professional, but he's doing it with his own resources rather than the kind of state-backed resources and passion. And so I'm certain that he's not an anomaly, that there's plenty of others that are.
For sure.
The other one that springs to mind, where I did research and also staged a couple of really fun events after my PhD, was in the south, in the Dordogne, called Chateau de Castelnau. It's a very famous, because they're famous. They have a small but very nice collection of arms and armor. They're famous. They have full-size trebuchet that they occasionally demonstrate. And so again, it's a privately owned enterprise, where it's like a small company that owns a few historic sites that they manage. And they do amazing things as well, and are, run a really good shop. And I've made good connections with there. So it's definitely there. And it kind of exists on the side of the kind of big state-run stuff. which, to be fair, probably isn't all that different from England, because you have the English heritage and, like national trust and similar properties, but then you have plenty of other small shops that are just doing thing with the resources they have and are frequently do a very good job with it.
True. So before now we dive into actual swords and weapons, there are a few greetings. So Julian from Switzerland, he does a lot of cool work as well. Maike, hi. We have a comment by JG Elmsley. So talking still about York. So
Excellent.
but I'll take you up on both you and James up on the suggestion, and as soon as I can go visit. And then Delatrix, hi, welcome to you too. Happy Friday to you as well. So, okay, let's get into weapons and swords. Well, first, I think, what is your field of interest? What kind of swords or weapons? Like, what's the core of what you really like?
Sure.
Yeah.
So probably my focus has tended to be on late medieval arms and armor. So roughly 14th to bleeding a little bit into the 16th century. That's the bit that that so far I've done the majority of my work in. But inevitably I've worked with stuff on either end of that kind of brief period. So I tend to tell people roughly 1300 to 1500.
Yeah.
But, the armories obviously bled both sides of that quite a bit. And, I got plenty by osmosis. But the PhD, for example, focused on roughly 1350 to 1500 for a number of reasons. One, there's a decent amount of weapons and armor from that period that's still surviving in collections. There's a fair amount of, that's basically when, the lion's share of the fencing treatises that are medieval exist from. You don't really get too much except for, 133 and the odd mention before that. Also, linguistic side of things, I don't speak Latin comfortably. So, my master's work was working mainly with Middle English. So I was time when that was flourishing. Mainly late medieval.
Do you see, like coming from Renaissance fairs and moving into academia, let's say in research, do you see a trend in, it seems to me like lots of times people get into medieval studies or passion with the early Middle Ages. There's like the really cool, like Viking vibe or the classic sword, the cross hilt, and the really like dark ages. And then though there's a kind of transition, I feel like a lot of people then move to the later Middle Ages because they're just so rich, and I feel like they're societies that are so much more relatable to us in a sense. They have a lot of things that are almost modern in like there's pre-industrial processes, there's international and it happening even before, of course. But have you noticed any of this in your experience?
I think it depends. I think for arms and armor, and especially for those who are trying to look into the practical side of things, so the kind of HEMA, historical combat side, certainly, because you start off very passionate about and enthusiastic about the early medieval stuff, the Viking, Saxon type of stuff, and then you get there and you just see the almost complete dearth of reliable source material about the stuff. You're like, oh, okay, so if I want to actually do anything with this, I've got to reverse engineer and apply loads of frog DNA and lots of interpretation of saying, well, okay, if you squint, this later stuff can kind of sort of be applied to what we think, these earlier weapons were used. So we can, can we draw inspiration from that? And then there's a whole lot of speculation and, to be fair, there's a whole lot of speculation, even the stuff we have reliable sources for, but there's a lot more of it because you don't have as much contemporary sources, as much contemporary kit that's survived. So you've got a lot less to work with. So yeah, you definitely see people that kind of trickle later who are interested in that side of things. But saying that, York, for example, I mean, York was a Viking city for a number of centuries, and it still has a very thriving early medieval studies kind of culture there. So, for other aspects of the period, there's still a very thriving scholarship for that sort of thing, and I see people up there very happily. But I think for the more kind of material arms and armor side of things, yeah, because there's a lot less stuff to work with. There's certainly a temptation to go later for more resource-rich environment.
And speaking of sources, you come to this not only as an academic, but even as a practitioner. So what do you specialize in terms of actual combat, or do you do HEMA, or do you still use the Western martial arts nomenclature?
I'm probably a bit of a Philistine in that, despite working heavily in this sector from a research standpoint, I never really got around all that much to getting heavily involved in the so-called HEMA scene. Because the last time I was, I do a lot of independent practice. The last time I was involved with a group was probably in the late 90s, early aughts, when we were still using motorcycle helmets and SCA armor, and none of this stuff had been codified. And I don't want to be polarizing, but I personally, while I was more heavily stuck into the research side of things, working at the armories and doing that, I kind of watched from the sidelines as the culture became more established, which is great because, we suddenly saw this big flourishing of people exchanging materials and ideas and everything. And that's the bit that I did like, and that I kind of was really enthusiastic about hanging out with the people that were doing the same thing. And then when I saw I'm going to sound really snobbish when I say this, and I don't intend to, but when I saw the practice become a little more codified and, dare I say, sporterized, when the leagues started to come into being, and you started having tournaments and ratings and purpose-made equipment, for the sport and all this stuff. That's not to say that far be it for me to say anything about people that enjoy that stuff, but that just became less my scene. I wasn't interested in competing in the tournaments. I was interested in learning the stuff with my, with the kit that I had. I didn't have the resources to drop down on purpose-made equipment. Mainly I couldn't either afford it, and when I could, it's like, really don't need it to do, what I enjoyed doing as far as the practice. So it just became kind of like okay, I'm still happy to hang out with these people and exchange ideas and things, but when it came to the kind of practice side, I started just kind of doing my own thing, hanging out with people that were doing their own thing and were happy to kind of have a meet and beat at times. And I never really got around to getting heavily involved in the kind of more established scene. So yeah, it's just, not because it was like, no, I don't like these people. It was just kind of, by the time I got around to having the time and the resources to maybe get involved, I was busy with doing other stuff. I was just like, oh, okay, it passed me by. Fair enough.
Yeah, and it is becoming more and more of a sport. So like in the chat I had a few weeks ago with Federico Malaguti, he's really reflecting a lot on the evolution of the sport. So, which is a good thing, as you mentioned. It's a sign of growth of the... But
exactly. And that's not to say that insights don't come out of that. It's not to say people that are doing that, for fun and or research aren't, getting good things out of it. It's just the kind of more formalized, like kind of tournament scene and circuit and all of that. It just didn't take my interest as much. I'm perfectly happy just to kind of stick my nose in my books and occasionally try things with a kind of small tribe of equally nerdy friends, and that makes me happy. And so it's like,
and I can imagine that if you get to hang out behind the scenes at the Royal Armoury or Tower of London, you'll probably choose to be there rather than
I
maybe,
think that's
yeah.
it. I think the kind of the key period in my life where I would have been most susceptible for just going whole hog into the HEMA scene as it is now. I was distracted with the kind of, playing with the stuff in stores, and that was when I was just really stuck into the more research based side of things.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I found my niche, and that's that. And then more recently, I've gotten more heavily involved in some of the more Asian arts. I'm a practitioner and now more recently in the last couple of years, a teacher of Tai Chi and related arts. And I found that the two marry together quite nicely in a way that purists might go, stoning offense, no. But I find kind of insights from both of them to inform each other in a way that I find interesting. It's not to say I'm going to impose it on anybody else. But I found practicing Tai Chi hugely affects my kind of physicality of how I practice, with the sword. But again, that's a personal insight. That's not something that I'm going to go out and say that it's kind of historical data.
Yeah.
So I guess for me, that's it. It's like, for me, slinging swords around is very much a kind of personal interest approach. And I'll do my research and I'll share what historical insights I found from the data that I found. But I'm not really concerned with trying to share my personal approach with people unless they ask. I teach a little bit for people that are interested, but I disclaim very heavily that what I do is kind of very much a hybrid system from my scenic route through various traditions.
Nice.
It's like, you want to come and learn how to swing a sword around? I'll help you. But I'm not going to pretend that it is authentically from this particular period or this particular master. It's drawn from all the stuff that I've studied over years and years, and it's what makes sense to me.
And I mean, every kind of interpretation does go, I mean, every technique now does go through interpretation, right? So it's,
exactly.
We don't have a
Short
living
of-
lineage of.
And short of, a blue phone box that travels through time materializing for us to go back, I'm very wary of people that are too confident in the veracity of their findings. It's like, we just don't know. Like I'm a lot more at ease around people that are like, I've got a lot of data that backs up my findings, and so I'm pretty confident about it. But at the end of the day, we're never going to be sure, because it's a dead tradition that we're having to reverse engineer.
Okay, so we'll dive into your research. Just have one comment here by James Elmsley again. You had motorcycle helmets luxury. So,
Yep.
yeah,
And
the
even then,
pioneers.
I still remember the faint taste of copper in my mouth whenever I hit my bell rung on it. So even that was enough.
Yeah. So, but he was in Scotland, I assume, fighting. So maybe difference in schools of thought, even in the pioneering era.
I mean, as an aside, before we wade in, because this is just the best story. My small group and I, we found out we legitimately spawned an urban legend in our community, because it was my mate Stefan Pasker, now Stefan Pasker Schellenbein, who I did a lot of Renaissance Fair fight show stuff with. And who I was also doing some initial work with, on the kind of HEMA side. Also Jeremy O'Neill, who kind of made his name doing jousting stuff and also some HEMA stuff. So it was a small band of us that were kind of doing Ren Fair stuff, but also researching the more historical side on the side. And we meet together in Stefan's workshop in the North Shore, about an hour or so outside of Boston. And they had this kind of rundown warehouse space that was both their workshop, because they made armor and repaired armor and weapons for use at the fairs. And we had a little corner off on the side that we kind of turned into a practice space where we would bash each other with weapons. And, we would spend these amazing kind of evenings blasting the Highlander soundtrack and, grinding burrs off of weapons and practicing and stuff. And it was fun. These were my kind of, evenings while I was at uni. And then years later, I can't remember exactly where, but I got into a conversation with someone who lived in the area. I said, they said, oh, I went to Dracut High School. I was like, oh yeah, the space where I used to practice was in Dracut. It was this kind of old factory space, and we used to get together and our practice sessions there. And I saw the color drain out of his face, and he was like, wait, you did it? What? It's like, why? It's like, because there was this urban legend going around my high school that there was like this medieval fight club that used to meet in this abandoned warehouse somewhere nearby and fight with swords. I was like, yeah, that's not an urban legend, that was us. I'm like, oh my God, it was real. Yes, it was real. So it's like we were an urban legend in the local high school.
That's pretty cool.
That
Yeah.
was
Nice. Okay, so damage to weapons
yes.
and how would you introduce the topic or the issue?
Right. Okay. So okay, let me take the scenic route to kind of get there, which is the kind of where my thinking was that led us here.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, it's changed quite a bit now, and I'm very happy because I'm seeing more and more kind of academic support and recognition and backing for research initiatives surrounding this stuff, which can only be good and only yield more insights. But that would not have been the case a handful of years back, where HEMA was still trying to kind of elbow a place onto the table for being a kind of legitimate academic pursuit, as opposed to just something that reenactors and their ilk, kind of did for funsies. And as a result of that, it was really, really difficult for anyone of independent means, because most of the research endeavors at that point were independent, to get the necessary resources to do a really, truly large-scale kind of data survey. You certainly had people that say, okay, I looked up some image sources and I found some interesting images that seemed to correspond to some of what we're seeing in the fencing treatises, the illustrations, and so some interesting correlations. But being able to do it at a scale that the academics would say would be close to statistically significant, that's quite a resource output, both in terms of time, to be able to do that work. And so there just wasn't much of it, even 5-6 years ago. So that was a major gap that that was needed to be addressed. But also, it had always nagged at me that while I'm trying to figure out how best to explain this, the fencing treatises are what we tend to look to as the best depiction of intentional combat from the period by people who considered themselves to be specialists on the topic. So we've got them as these kind of glances into what the fighting might have been like at the time in certain circumstances, but there's still loads of wild cards that we hadn't been able to verify. To what extent was what was being shown in these treatises widespread? Was it just an elite pursuit of the people who could afford to pay the masters or to afford the books? Was this were these ideas confined to only a very, very small circle of people who could afford access to them? Were they even viewed as reliable, actual, practical fighting techniques by the people that actually did this stuff for real, or was it purely like an over-intellectualized exercise of putting this down? But if someone was actually going to trust their life to this stuff, they'd be like, yeah, I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. I'm just going to, I'm going to trust much more tried and true techniques, not some fancy master that does all these fancy things. Was that the case? We don't know. Were the masters actually any good? Just because I'm sure we know loads of people that published lots and lots of pages about things that are absolute muppets. So it's like, we have to be careful not to fall into the trap that just because someone published something and it survived, that they were actually any good at it and actually knew what they were talking about. So there's all these wild cards that you have to be careful of if you just trust what the treatises are showing and telling. On the other side, we have quite a lot of other resources that can paint a picture as well, but just not as directly. So you have things like the surviving arms and armor from the period, how it's designed, how it may have been damaged through use, that there's still evidence of that on there. Can we learn to read that, and can that paint some picture about how these things were actually used? Then you have, of course, the multitude of artwork from the period that, yes, they may not have been painted or created by martial artists, but it kind of reflects the popular perception of these things.
Mm-hmm.
So, just like today, if you ask someone on the street to paint a soldier, they may not necessarily have served, but most people in our culture can paint a pretty good picture of what a soldier looks like, just because they've been inundated with images from it and they've seen them. So, it's not just... Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. No, I just wanted to, I would imagine it would be even more true in the Middle Ages, when service in some form in the military would have been really widespread throughout the population. So
yeah, exactly.
I imagine a painter painting something completely unrealistic would have not been commissioned for many jobs.
Not to say they didn't, but basically, you look at the artwork, you get a sense of what the popular perception is, whether it was accurate or not. Then you also have the skeletal remains from not just major mass graves of places like Towton and Brisbane that everyone knows about, but also cemeteries that have been excavated where they found the odd skeleton that has shown some signs of wounds that have that are still visible. So you've got all these other kind of sources which can tell parts of the story, and that's actual evidence of the reality of the situation in piecemeal. Mm-hmm. So basically what I wanted to do with the research project was take all of this, gather together all of this stuff as much as I was capable. So for the arms and armor, traces of damage from use, from the images, just depictions of combat, and then from the skeletal remains, evidence of wounds that have remained. Put all of this together, look at it together, and answer a handful of questions. So one, what story do each of those individual sources tell about the nature of combat? So look at them each in isolation. So the what I call the sources, which are those three, and then the fencing treatises kind of off on their own, which are kind of set apart for now. So what story do each of those groups tell on their own? Then, do they correspond? Do the stories that each of them tell from analyzing these sources, do they match up? Do they seem to correlate? And then, how do those stories of the weapons, the images, and the skeletal remains, how do they match up when you hold them up next to the treatises? Do they tell the same story? Are there differences? If so, what are they? Why could there be differences? And so that was kind of the major kind of thrust of the research, was to answer those questions like that. And without doing an exhaustive breakdown of all of that, one, we don't have time for that here, and two, hopefully when I get around to publishing the bloody thing, you'll be able to read for yourself. But the short story is, I was pleasantly surprised, well, not surprised, but I was pleased to discover that there was actually quite a lot of overlap. The kind of material culture sources corresponded in my analysis with what's going on and was being depicted in the fencing treatises in more places than they didn't. There was plenty of outliers. There was plenty of stuff in the fencing treatises that I couldn't point to correspondences in the material sources, but there's also plenty of reasons for that, just because of the limits of what you could and couldn't derive from analyzing those sources.
Yeah.
But all in all, it's like they corresponded quite a bit. So what I wanted to do was to first off create this method for being able to approach all these sources and analyze them in a systematic way. And through the thesis, prove that this method could hold water, through my attempt at doing it in a small way.
Mm-hmm.
And then actually show, well, okay, here's what you can and can't from at least my own analysis. Here's what you can and can't tell from studying these things. And, here's some of the bits that are going on in the treatises that there seems to be pretty solid evidence was at least widespread enough, understood and or possibly practiced that you could find traces of it in, the source material that's currently existing, which obviously is a drop in the bucket from what was there.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's enough of it to kind of take notice in what's survived to us today, that's a reasonable assumption that ideas like that were perhaps reasonably widespread.
And I think one of the cool things you mentioned already just now, but also before we started, that I think really resonated with me is this thing that your research is meant to be kind of a method. So for all of you listening, there is a way, and James kind of opens the door to that perhaps, but it's beginning of a path, let's say, into looking into this kind of data, if you're interested. So yeah, it's refreshing to hear that, when there's a new field kind of in a sense of observation being open and people can carry that.
I hope a new way of taking the information that we currently have to hand, and it's a new lens at being able, allowing you to look at it in a different way and how to apply it to what it is we do. And I hope it's something that other people can pick up and apply to sources that I didn't have the opportunity to get to for whatever reason. And also, in a world where someone rocks up and writes me a blank check saying, go forth and spend the rest of your life doing the research that you want to do, my hope was that that method could be applied in slightly different ways to periods and to materials from times that we have less stuff on. So for example, I focused on the late medieval period, that kind of 1350 to 1500 period, because we had a good amount of material and we had a good amount of fencing treatises from that period that I could match the two of them up. Knowing that now, the possibility exists to...
Just a second, sorry, someone's knocking at the door.
Okay.
No, someone locked themselves out. I have to be right back, sorry.
Sure thing, no worries.
Okay, emergency.
Crisis averted.
Can you hear me still?
Yep, you can still hear you.
Yes, I can't hear you though. So what happened?
Test 1, 2. Can you hear me now?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Yes, and I can hear you. Okay, sorry everyone. We had a little.
This is the excitement of live theater.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything can and does happen. So yeah, I chose a specific kind of resource-rich period for this to kind of design, improve the method.
Yeah.
But that means that other people, who perhaps have more time and resources than I currently do, can take it and first off apply it more to that period and get to the bits that I didn't get the chance to get to and fill in the gaps that I left, of which there are many. But also do things like take the method and move it forward into, say, the 16th, 17th century, where we have a wealth of material, both in terms of and stuff, and then use it to verify it. take the same methods and say, okay, we're going to put the masters on trial. We're going to test whether or not these guys actually A, knew what they're talking about, and B, if what they were talking about was actually made much use of out in the real world. And then perhaps for me, even more excitingly, taking it backwards to earlier periods where we don't have the treatises, we don't have the manuals and the masters, but we have at least a fair amount of material culture, perhaps a fair amount of artwork and certainly skeletal remains that have got wounds on them, and see if we can't almost like algebraically solve for the missing bit.
That's
So
really cool.
we don't have the manuals, but we've got all these other kind of material culture. Can we apply this method, and can we perhaps make some perhaps more informed theories about what the stuff may be like by using a method like this? Yeah, that's a bit that's exciting to me. It's like, can we decode early medieval combat using a method like this in a way that's perhaps a bit more kind of data informed?
Yeah, and
not just kind of saying, well, I'm going to take Talhofer's sword and dueling shield work, and I'm going to apply that to sword and shield in the 9th century. It's not to say you can't derive insights from that, but maybe there are other ways that are perhaps more robust.
how far back have you let yourself free to imagine this method working? Like,
I mean, I haven't. I
okay.
mean, if people want to try to take this to, Byzantine cavalry manuals and stuff from, like late Roman and antique stuff, go for it.
Yeah.
Who am I to get in your way? If you can make a case that it works,
Yeah, because as you were talking, my mind went straight away to Rome, and we do have some descriptions of fighting. Yeah, we don't have like manuals or stuff, but there are some descriptions of the time. There's a lot of depictions, and then there's a lot of, well, relatively, I guess, a lot of material surviving. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
where I went right away.
Yeah, sure. I don't see, again, I'm not going to say, yes, we'll solve it, but it can't hurt to try it and see what happens.
Okay, so the breakdown of the method essentially is you have your control group, could we say, or something like that? That's or what you want to verify, which are the treatises, and then you verify them through the observation of existing documents, in a sense, or material documents in the form of wounds to bones, in the form of damage to weapons and armor, and what was the third one you mentioned? I'm already missing that.
The image sources.
Yes, the image sources, exactly. Okay, cool. And
so it's kind of it's a multi-step process. Like, one is like analyzing each one of those groups in isolation. So let's take the damage to the weapons, for example, because that's the bit that's probably of most interest to the people here. So it's first off creating a method by which you're cataloging and recognizing all the different types of damage. So, in the times of looking at kind of nicks and scratches and dents and obvious signs of maintenance and repair on blades and hilts and bits of armor and this sort of thing. First off, trying to create a kind of typology of types of damage. And I made a reasonable crack at that, some of which I don't stand behind even, anymore, that I've kind of, it's inevitable. You publish a thesis and immediately you start thinking, being like, actually, you know what, this would have been better off like this. So probably by the time I get around to publishing this, it'll be slightly revamped into kind of more refined. But I created a kind of typology of, these are kind of distinct groups and types of damage that seems to be recurring enough where I can kind of say that's distinct. That's distinct where that was made in a particular way and possibly for a particular reason. And so then you start to try to decode, well, okay, what could have made these various types of nicks and dents? If it's angled in this such a way, or if it's shaped like this, is it the result of a particular type of surface hitting it in a particular way? Is it Is it because there was a different type of nick there and it was ground down to repair the blade so that it wouldn't create a weak spot? All these different variables that you've got to kind of think about. And then gradually you can start to kind of construct a language of the damage, where it's like, okay, we can't be certain, but if there is a notch in a blade that's located here and it's shaped like this and it's angled in just such a way, then you can come up with rarely a single scenario, but at least a small short list of possible scenarios of what could have been the result of that. So it's like, okay, if the user was holding the blade like this and the incoming receiving edge was coming from either this way or this way or this way, like you can kind of construct a small handful of plausible scenarios out of all the possible ones. And then also you're looking at location on the blade. If it's towards the strong, then it's more likely to have possibly been a result of a defensive action. If it's more towards the the weak or the foible, then the possibility of it being as the result of an offensive action is more likely. And so, from all these different things, you start to kind of construct a language to be able to kind of read the blade and come up with a smaller series of plausible scenarios as to what could have caused the damage. And from that, you can start to paint the picture of the types of techniques that could have resulted in that kind of damage. Sometimes it's really, really general in a way that isn't terribly exciting and doesn't really produce a eureka moment. Sometimes, however, it does. Like the stuff that I can give for really prime examples is I managed to find a fair amount of damage to blades that lent pretty reliable, in my opinion, credence to frequent intentional use of the false edge, for example.
Okay.
And this was one from examining, double-edged weapons and finding damage to both edges, sometimes in different places. So in that time, say, okay, so we don't know if there was ever a designated false edge or true edge for this because it's symmetrical, and so it depended on how it was being held at the time. So, okay, it's like, it's interesting that the damage is different on the two edges, but it's nothing conclusive. Then you find swords, for example, where there was for double-edged swords, but there was a designated false edge because of some design element. So it only could have been scabbard, and it only could have been drawn and used in a particular way. And you still find damage on both edges, and you still find that the edges, the two edges are damaged in slightly different ways. Ooh, interesting. Okay. Then you find things like the poster child for this for me is there is this absolutely beautiful messer in the collection in the I'm having to harken back 7 years for this, in the German National Museum in Nuremberg. Is this beautiful messer with this really ornate boxwood carved handle. So it's a pretty piece, but it's still a very business-like piece because it has nicked to all get out. And there is not just quite substantial notching to the edge, but also the back edge, both the little bit that is sharpened toward the tip, and also full of notches on the blunt spine as well. And you need only look at the various messer treatises to talk, to see the references to those kind of back edge parries, receiving the edge, on the blunted bit. And it's there. It's there plain as day. And it was so exciting to actually see that in the flesh on something that was like, I can pick you up and I can look at this and I can tell you with pretty good reliability what would have caused these things, because it's right there and it's mirrored in the treatises.
So probably a lot of the HEMA people are already in their head thinking, "Oh, okay, where do I know and oh, that's probably what can I look
Like
at next time I go
you
to a
can pick
museum?"
up, you can pick up a handful of Le Kushner's and Talhofer's images
Yeah.
of kind of setting aside with the back edge so that you flick forward with the, with the true into cuts and everything. And this one beautiful Messer in Nuremberg, it's there in the flesh or metal, so to speak.
Were there any unexpected surprises in the sense of something that you noticed in the weapons that was like, "Oh, we wouldn't have thought it to be used in this way," or this damage is in a position that
Um, One thing that was particularly gratifying, and I know that it's become a theory that has become less popular of late, which I'm happy to see, but um, in circles where I wasn't worried about ruffling too many feathers, I used to joke when I was doing the PhD saying, part of the reason that I'm doing this research is that I can finally put the final nail in the coffin to the bloody flat edge parries theory. And so I was obviously keeping an eye out to say, okay, not to say that a flat would be damaged in the same way that an edge would, but you would expect, if it was as widespread as the support for that theory suggested, you would find some kind of evidence of the flat being battered as much as we claim the edge was. And I think I can count on one hand the number of instances of that, and it was
Hmm.
on, and all of them were, I believe, on a single sword in the Musée de Cluny.
Oh,
It
interesting.
was like I found next to no evidence of flat, of
Yeah.
substantial, regular, purpose-made flat parrying. So that seemed like at least the evidence to put that to bed. That's not to say I didn't find plenty of people who kind of take the middle ground of saying that it wasn't kind of 90 degree, but a lot of kind of side on in order to set
Hmm.
aside static parries and all that stuff. I found plenty of images of damage to suggest that you weren't taking 90-degree edge to 90-degree edge. So, okay, perfectly fine as you're, because we're talking about two weapons in movement as you're
Hmm.
receiving. But when I first, were getting involved with this, and you were dealing with kind of John Clemens's very, regimented, flat of, flat of strong argument, and I just didn't find it. So that was particularly gratifying, given how much that theory irked me for so long. But trying to think of other bits surprising.
Or
There
even
was
bits
quite,
that
there was quite a
disproved
bit.
something in the treatises.
Um, there was quite a bit of, if my memory serves me, there was quite a bit where the locations of the damage was not as textbook as
Mm.
you would expect. Like, okay, the, defensive stuff really clustered only towards the bottom third, and the, more offensive seeming stuff only clustered towards the top third of the blade. In a way where someone who really knew what they're doing was, being really precise in placement of things. I found quite a lot of stuff in the middle. And
Mm.
yeah, granted, towards the kind of lower and upper end of the middle. But that kind of lack of precision, to me, that almost makes perfect sense, because in the heat of things, you're not always going to land the perfect shot or the perfectly placed, defensive maneuver. Quite a lot of that stuff in the heat of going, is going to be, you're going to, if you're well trained enough, you're going to try as best as you can to get the placement of those things precisely. But the number of times you're going to pull it off textbook is probably not going to be that much. So seeing quite a lot of damage clustered more towards the middle of the blade, but not directly in the middle. So you could still tell, okay, there's a little bit more towards the kind of upper middle
Yeah.
and lower. Like, okay, you can see that they were trying still to do that. So the principle still held up. but the kind of precision of the execution, didn't always hold up. To me, that's the human element. That's like, okay, people understood this enough where they were trying, but they didn't always succeed, which makes perfect sense.
And of course, we, the masters, whoever wrote the treatises, the instructors and the experts would have distilled their knowledge from actual use. So it makes sense that they kind of have showed the perfect version.
Yeah.
But what we do today is derive modern practice from that perfect version. Do you think this skews modern practice in a sense towards like the fact that we start studying or looking at things or practicing from the like ideal versus the real battlefield and like getting thrown in the meat grinder, let's say?
Yeah, I think it can be very easy to fall into the trap of being too slavish to the treatises. I think if you do that, one, you let the perfect become the enemy of the good, but also you miss out on the possibility that what is preserved in the treatises is only a small portion of actual practice. You could restrict yourself quite a bit to that. And that's actually why one of my favorite masters is probably one of the least kind of practical in terms of getting like actual tactical technique out of the treatises. And that's, I'm blanking on his name. His book is right over here. I'm blanking on his name.
Worst moment.
Here it is. Pietro Monte. Because Monte, we've only really recently in the last handful of years started to appreciate him since Geoffrey Forgang's translations come out and a lot more has been kind of written about him. But Monte, for those who don't know, was this kind of late kind of turn of the 16th century. Like, he was a professional soldier and scrapper in the latter part of the 15th century, and then into the 16th century kind of retired towards the more kind of cushy fencing master for the elite. And he's got quite a pedigree when he got into that. Like, we have letters of him being consulted by Da Vinci for, design elements of things like throwing darts and things like that. He's mentioned by name in the Book of the Courtier, Castiglione's book, several times as, as this fine upstanding master of athletics and, and the art of arms. So it's like the guy got around and he was a name. But you read his book and he's also he's very scrappy and practical. And he'll talk about, you only need these, few techniques for the sword, and these are the only ones that really matter. Or, this technique is great with a tournament when you're trying to, show off. But if you're really trying to defend your life, you can dispense with that crap and just do this. I appreciate that because you get that kind of. This is someone who, his method was tried and trusted because he's teaching from life experience, and probably teaching a bit of floof because that's who he's catering to as well. But you can tell he gets very, in his own book, he gets very down and dirty and practical, and I appreciate that. I think obviously the treatises are, a great port of call because it's what we've got that it's actually dedicated towards trying to depict techniques that were allegedly in use from the period. But I think you miss out if you restrict yourself to that. I've gotten interesting insights from the study of the material sources where, as a result of looking at the weapons, I don't worry so much about being precise because they didn't. It's kind of like if you talk to people who are specialists in historical clothing, they're the best reenactors because there's like, as soon as I handled my first historical garment, I stopped worrying about the precision of my stitch work, because when you look at a historical garment, it's a mess. The stitch work is terrible, but it's practical and, it's effective. So they, immediately they don't worry about the precision of it anymore.
I never got to handle anything, but at the Museo Correr in Venice, there's a buff leather coat
Oh yeah,
worn by
yeah.
one of the Doges. And it's not behind glass or anything. You can see, you can really like, or maybe it's, I'm not, but you can really go up and look at it. And I mean, for being the buff coat of the most powerful man in Venice, it's like,
Yep.
okay, I think I can stitch that.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
yeah,
And it's the same principle. Like honestly, if you look at some of the most iconic armors in the world up close, you kind of go, oh, okay, really kind of, you can tell where they phoned it in and just put some gloss over it.
Mm-mm-mm.
And so it's when you see that kind of practical human element, you don't put these people on a pedestal. Like it could be really easy to think, oh, at a time where people needed these arts to defend their lives, like everyone was this kind of ninja and kind of super martial artist and everything. It's like, no, they're the same people with the same capabilities and the same distractible nature
Yeah.
and we are. It's like we just don't need to use this stuff for keeps anymore. But that doesn't mean that they were any better at it than someone that really dedicates themselves now was.
Yeah.
So I guess if anything, like kind of all this has kind of taught me just like to don't sweat it as much.
Well, that's a good learning for sure.
Yeah.
We have a couple of comments about the old school HEMA, or so we have Scottish Wizard. He must become a shadow of its former self, having seen what Paul MacDonald and the Dawn Dualist Society were doing in Edinburgh in the 90s. Myself with the Great Fires, Celtic Wars in Glasgow. So, and Elmsley, which is from the neighborhood, also
I've heard
agrees.
I've heard stories from those from Guy and from the other people that were around there at that time. I mean, again, yeah, at the time, in those days, I wasn't terribly involved in even the kind of formal scene, but I've heard stories. And again, I'm not gonna apply value judgment to it because again, I've met a lot of people who are very, very active in the current scene who at the end of the day they find their practice very fulfilling and they do great research and everything. And to me I think for me, and people will disagree with this comparison. I think what we're going through now is the same kind of process that Kendo did when it slowly started to decouple from people who were learning swords to actually defend their lives with it. That's not to say that you couldn't become an incredibly accomplished swordsman from practicing Kendo and competing in the sport of Kendo, because as a sport in and of itself, it's an amazing athletic pursuit. But it becomes tricky to draw a straight line from that to actual playing for keeps swordsmanship. And I think we're in a lot of cases we're following the same trajectory as HEMA becomes more codified. What is necessary in order to succeed in that environment is not necessarily the same things that's necessary to succeed to defend your life with this stuff. And that's not to say one's better than the other. It's horses for courses. So it's like I think if you want to practice in order to succeed in the more, quote unquote, sporterized, tournament scene, you're going to practice a certain skill set. If you're trying to practice because you want to get a better understanding of what this was like as a living martial art by people who practiced it to defend themselves with, you're probably going to take a different approach and you're probably going to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize other things for that. So I guess it's a matter of what you want to get out of it. I don't think one's any better than the other. It's just what do you want to do with it?
Yeah, it's an interesting, and it's a topic, well, a point of conversation that's been coming out so far, I think in all of the conversations I've had, and not because I'm pushing forward. It just seems that whatever the path someone comes from, this kind of disconnect between the sport aspect that's codified and has these strict rules and needs to abide by certain kind of practice, diverges a little from, let's say, the real aspects of combat. So, talking with Julian, we even just the kind of steel that
Mhm.
is used changes
Yeah.
the way things. And or also like when I had a chat with Dequitin, the use of the dagger. So he does these
Mhm.
realistic, let's say, non-choreographed fights, and they always end with grappling and like the very dirty and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
non-beautiful, and with just a dagger plunging in the, in between plates and stuff. And yeah, that is how, and it obviously makes sense. You're not trying to score a point. But yeah, on the other hand, the sport aspect too is full of really interesting research and
Yeah. I
learnings.
think you need both.
Yeah, right. And I think, I mean, it's better for things to become a bigger sport and more people to have the door to history open, let's say, rather than less.
Yeah, it's a gateway drug. People
Mm-mm-mm.
that you know there's people that want to come just to be able to play with swords in this day and age, and they're going to flourish in that. And out of that, there's going to be people that decide to get a little bit more research oriented and be like, all
Yeah.
right, I want to go this way. And there's going to be other people that kind of are going to take a more, if you want to call it living history approach, being like, okay, I'm not as interested in the sports side of things. I want to get a sense of what this was really, truly,
Mm-mm-mm.
what we can learn about that. And they're going to go off in that way. But, it's like, it's the party invite. And then people go off to where they want to take with it from
Yeah.
that point.
And Elmsley has another comment here, which, yeah, you don't have the risk of loss or injury, and that changes psychology and biomechanics as well. And
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
definitely true.
And it's also kind of, rules are there for our safety today.
Yeah.
I mean, I I used to hang out with some people that were involved in the SCA. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a bigger thing in the US. I think it exists to a limited
Uh,
extent in
Not
Europe,
super
but
familiar, but yeah.
yeah. But they have their own method of armored combat, and it's with kind of rattan
Hmm.
sticks. There, it has its own rule set. I met people who are devastatingly good at it, and so it's like, fair play. I tried it a few times. It wasn't my thing because I
Mm.
find myself stifled by the restrictions, both of the equipment and the rule set, which were there perfectly understandably for the safety of the people doing it. But it wasn't for me because it's like,
Yeah.
the instinct when someone got up in my face was to take this massive heater shield that I have and wrap it around the back of their head. Like, oh, you can't do that. Okay, lesson
Yeah.
learned. Um,
Yeah, I mean, whatever opens the doors. I'm almost doing the opposite path. So I came in as a collector and as a person interested more in antiques. Then I started studying, like formally, and now I'm finding that I also feel that gap in practice. So I'm starting to look at HEMA as a way to fill that gap. I just think it's important to have like the all round. But going back to your research, one question that popped to mind as we were talking literally about this now is, um, did you notice any difference in damage between, let's say, swords or weapons of the wealthy versus, like, can we see a difference in training on the weapons people used?
so I wanted to look at this. So
Hmm.
when I was analyzing the weapons, I tried to. I mean, you can never be fully precise but I tried where possible to take note of the kind of quality and presumed status of the weapons.
Hmm.
Because there's some where it's obvious. I got the chance to examine a couple of weapons used by known personalities, not least of which there's a dagger in the Kunsthistorische Museum that belongs to Maximilian I.
Oh, well,
Cool. And then I also got to play in Copenhagen.
hmm.
I got to examine a messer that was gifted to the, I think the prince at the time by Maximilian. I think it was a wedding present or something similar to that. So this was in his possession, and these were ridiculously high status weapons, like the ornate decoration on the hilt work, the messer, the whole blade was literally scallop etched. So like the blade looked kind of, had almost like fish scale patterns down it. Absolutely gorgeous. So it's like, these are bling weapons.
Yeah.
But still, you look at the damage on them, they were still very businesslike in how they were used. And so I tried to take note of those and then compared to the more kind of down and dirty munitions grade stuff. And I tried to see if I could draw lines that might indicate specialized training and not so specialized training. I didn't really find anything that I was willing to kind of state definitively. So yeah, we don't know, which in a way that works both ways. That could suggest that some of these principles were universal enough that even if people who weren't reading these things, that they were kind of, they either trickled down either through kind of people talking and, exchanging ideas outside of these kind of cliques of high status martial arts practice, or some of the stuff was just so self-evident that someone who is just comfortable enough with a weapon just through use and experience is going to arrive at some of the same conclusions that this is a good way to use it.
Elmsley has, I think, a few more details on the one in Copenhagen, I think. So gifted from Maximilian to Christian, the first or second, part of the Summersperger group.
Yep, that's the chap.
Cool.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. And one of the cool things, and this is a rabbit hole that I didn't get the chance to tumble down during the research, but I'd always kind of earmarked to. I want to go back and look at that closely. Was I found a handful of weapons that had historically been marked as being ceremonial weapons. So ones were either parade or kind of ceremonial occasions, things for processional use, that had damage to the blades, sometimes substantial damage to the blades. And it made me raise this question. I'll give you a concrete example. I was lucky enough to do my research trip to the Musée de l'Armée just after the Agincourt exhibition closed. And this was intentional. They basically said, come now because everything hasn't gone home yet and it's all just sitting out in open storage. So this is the prime time to get stuck in before stuff goes back into cases and things. So I spent a week there and that was like Candyland. That was amazing. Some of the things over there. And the curator, just for a bit of fun, is like, have a look at this. It won't be relevant to your research because it's this kind of, ceremony weapon, but this is this really iconic. This is the sword of the Constable of France. This is
I saw it. I saw it last week. I was there. Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's beautiful. Yeah. And he's like, this is going to go back into a cage, but to the case pretty soon. But while it's out, have a bit of a geek out at this. When are you ever going to be able to hold this again? And he's like, it's not relevant to your research, but it's just cool. Have a look. And I looked at it, and after the initial factor wore off, I took a closer look, and I thought, are you sure? He's like, why? What do you mean? It's like, well, get a look at that, and that, and that. And there was like, I think if I remember correctly, I cataloged like 20 notches and dings in the blade because the hilt is very, very ornate. And the blade has some later kind of etching and gilding and stuff done to it. But the blade itself is actually a pretty textbook kind of late 14th, early 15th century in its shape and its design. Is a very textbook kind of broad-bladed cut and thrust hilt, cut and thrust blade rather. And so it got me thinking. I was like, are we dealing with, I'm not suggesting that the sword in its current state was ever actually used. And for all I know, some of that could have been when it was being kind of used and abused during the revolution, when, you know, people were just like, you know, rah, just playing with it in an irreverent way. But there's also a fair lot of damage to that matched up with very, very business-like weapons that had a solid military context to them. So it raised the question of like, are we dealing with ceremonial weapons that used recycled blades? So it's like the whole thing wasn't purpose-made as a ceremonial weapon. Did they use an old blade that was lying around and repurpose it for this beautiful weapon? Either for practicality's sake, because we have precedent for this, say, for example, funerary helms. There's a big precedent for this in England. Very rarely was the helm that's on someone's tomb the helm they actually wore. A lot of times it's like, right, we need a helm to go on this guy's tomb. I'll just get any old one and doll it up and plonk it there. So there's precedent for that mentality. So it's like, could have just been, right, we need a blade and we're going to bling up the hilt. Okay, good. This has been kicking around the workshop. Right, okay, job's a good one. Is it also possible, the slightly more sexy possibility, that the blade was somehow of some kind of significant provenance? Was it the blade that belonged to someone significant? Was the blade present for some significant event that now has significance that may now be to us lost? That at the time we're like, okay, we're going to make the ceremonial blade out of this guy's sword because this is meaningful to us, and then over time that has been forgotten. Possible. And so after that experience in Paris, I kind of kept my eyes open whenever I was in another collection that had a ceremonial blade. I was like, weird question, can I take a closer look at that? And I found about 3 or 4 more that fell in that same category. And so it was enough. I don't meant to get around to, I made mention of it in my thesis, but I always meant to get around. It's like, I want to write an article kind of where I talk about this. Is like, is this, because it seems to be a thing. And it's like, what's going on here?
Just out of statistical curiosity, like 4 or 5 ceremonial swords have damage out of how many you observed? Is it like a significant percentage?
Well, I didn't get the chance to play with too many ceremonial swords, but of the ones that I examined, I was just like, okay, that seems to be in the same box. I want to take a look at it. Most of them had damage to their blades. Like the ones, I'm rattling these off the top of my head, but there's the Sword of the Constable of France. There's the famous dragon-hilted sword in Vienna. That was, I believe, Sigismund's. And it's got the kind of really gilt, long-necked dragons swirling along the hilt. Same thing, that one. I found quite a number of notches because, again, the blade, if you take away the decoration, is still very businesslike and very practical. One in Copenhagen that the hilt is now made to look like a more kind of early medieval kind of hilt, but the blade is very much not from that period. And so, you know, it's very clear that you have a new hilt furniture on this. The blade is very dim. So it's like enough of them that it just seemed to not be anomalous. It's like, okay, this is a thing. And again, it's not statistically significant by any stretch because again, I'm dealing with about 4 or 5 pieces. But it's enough for me to kind of go, something's up here and I want to look closer at it.
And also, it's not like there are millions of ceremonial swords around. So
indeed,
yeah. Oh, I wish we had this conversation before last week because I would have.
So everyone watching, consider this a call to arms. If you go to your local connections and take a closer look at these things. A lot of times you can find these things just through spot checks, even through the glass. You don't even have to hold the thing in your hand because a lot of times these notches are visible and get close enough up. So if you go and look. By all means.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, if you do go to Paris, if you have it on your plans soon, it's in when you get into the medieval exhibit in front of, there's a giant bombard, I think, with its barrel facing right at you. And in a glass on the right is the sword we're talking about. It's stunning.
And if you're going there, another one, you probably saw this. I examined armor, because this is worth bringing this up as well, because we've been talking about the swords. I examined
Yes.
armor for damage as well, and I found some, but much, much less.
Mm.
And there's a number of reasons for that. It could be a testament that the armor worked, and that the glancing surfaces did the glancing that they were supposed to do. It also could have been that the armor was much more rigorously maintained. You don't want to keep notches because those are points of weakness.
Mm-mm-mm.
But I did find a couple with some really nice telltale donks that seemed to indicate, wow, okay, that was definitely a target area. And the best one of my favorites, was one of the bassinets in
Mm-hmm.
Paris.
Yep.
I think there's like two very iconic Milanese bassinets from about like 1390 or so. Mumble. They're on display.
Yeah.
And there's one, again, if you go, take a look. It has over its, I want to say, I'm not even going to say whether it's right or left, but just look at the sights on the visor. And if you look close toward the edge of one of them, I think it's the left as the person that wears it, but it could be the right. Anyway, just take a look. There is the most brilliant dent that crosses the well, not dent, like a kind of ding in the because the site is it's proud of the pokes out, and there's this donk that just goes across the opening of the site, and you get this triangular bend in of the metal, and then you cross the site, and right across you get the same thing. And it's very clear that this poor guy at some point, some kind of edged weapon, whether it was a sword or an axe or something, that just went pank right across the visor, just almost straight up and down. And obviously it stood, but it's so textbook there, and it's just beautiful to see. And you just look at it and you go, ooh, that would have rung anyone's bell to see that.
Pretty sure someone paid a visit to the local cathedral very soon after the battle.
Yeah. But
sorry.
And a few others to kind of some of the, like I found one to the fan plate of a knee protection, and it's textbook example of what that is there to do, of stop a cut from getting around the back of the knee that's exposed.
Mm-mm-mm.
Nice little triangular ding right in there. It's like, oh, it did its job, just like it's supposed to. And seeing little things like that was always really gratifying to actually see for real.
How do you tell damage of the time from, as you mentioned, French Revolution, partying, or
misuse or wear and tear?
Exactly.
I worked hard to create a criteria that I operated by, because again, I'm not going to say this is the definitive way of thing. I created a criteria that I would work by, that I would use to kind of weed out stuff that I wasn't going to look at. First off, I took a very ruthless, when in doubt, disregard approach. So probably a lot more damage on these things that I didn't document because I wasn't sure, given how I was judging it. I wanted to err on that side rather than documenting stuff that could be wrong.
Yeah.
So first off, the damage by wear has a greater tendency to be not very geometric. When it's through corrosion, eating into the metal, this stuff tends to be really, really jagged and not in a way that when you hold up kind of a very obviously notched blade next to one that's just the metal is being eaten through neglect, the contrast is pretty stark. So being able to tell, okay, this is from just because the metal's being eaten, became pretty simple once you saw enough of them and kind of developed the eye for it. So the damage from use tended to be a little more regularized in their edges and the geometric shape of it. A lot of very kind of pointed triangular notches digging straight into the or more rounded notches. Sometimes that was a result of kind of striking a rounded surface. Sometimes that was a repair function where they'd actually go in and grind out the triangular notch, so damage further through wear. But generally speaking, like there was more of a regularity to the shape of the damage from use. So that was the kind of most blunt instrument I used for weeding out the types of damage. Also, context and provenance of the objects. Some of those pieces that I used, that I examined, couldn't have been monkeyed around with later because they came out of a river in the 1970s. The Castillon pieces, for example, or had literally hung in in the same place for, I examined a few that were part of the what are called Arabic inscription swords. So these are ones that had been trophy arms hung in the Hall of Victories in Alexandria, either captured by the Ottomans or the Mamelukes in the 14th and 15th century, or were given as diplomatic gifts. And they were basically hung there as trophies of, look at this European booty that we nicked, and we're going to display it proudly. And it hung there basically until the modern period. And the likelihood that stuff like that would have been taken down and played with is, not to say it's impossible, but is much reduced. Or again, still living arsenals. There's the the civic arsenal in Vienna. That's so some of the stuff was basically, it was the wardrobe that when call to arms came, you went there and you got kitted out. So not to say it's impossible, people didn't muck around with it later, but the likelihood is reduced because it was, it had a different use. So context mattered as well. But again, that was always a specter of, Victorian collectors loving to play around with their stuff. And, my first museum gig was the Higgins Armory Museum in Worcester, because that's where. And, there's, Higgins, there's loads of photographs of John Higgins prancing around in his favorite 16th century armors that make us now kind of go, ugh. And there's records in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris in the 1860s of them lending out armor and even weapons to local opera companies for productions. And there's no what was done stuff at that point and what condition it was when it came back. So it's like that was always something that I had to keep in mind. So I tried to create a control group of, even within that, of weapons where the provenance was solid, where it's like the likelihood that they were being monkeyed around with later was as close to zero as possible. And then I use them to compare, okay, are the patterns here different from ones that I can't be sure of? And 9 times out of 10, there wasn't enough for me to be able to tell. So again, I couldn't draw any solid conclusions from that, but that might suggest that while we have this terrifying romantic image of Victorian collectors playing Count of Monte Cristo with swords, it probably didn't happen as often as we fear.
I think sometimes we're a bit too strict with them.
I mean, the poster child for this more recently is Oakshott. Oakshott, sadly, I never met the man, but I met those who met them. And he took a very hands-on approach to this stuff. Like he was just, no, don't, throw away those cotton gloves. Here's the, 12th century sword, fill your boots. And he just plunk it in your hand. And, he wasn't irreverent with them, but he believes like these things, they're in good condition. They were made to be used and they're made to be appreciated, here. And I appreciate that to an extent because my training as a curator was, cotton gloves, everything. And, that's important if you're trying to preserve a collection. But if you want to learn from the collection, then people like Oakshott are important too.
Yeah, definitely. We have a comment again by James Elmsley. So the stuff in the Hagja Eirene was left in atrocious state up to the 1890s or so. So I'd be cautious
Yes.
of the stuff there.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
have
I
to
mean, the
check out
stuff
those
that
photos.
I never made it to the actual site because having to navigate the kind of Turkish bureaucracy to get permission to look at the stuff that's still there is next to impossible unless you know somebody. So the few pieces that I examined are ones that had kind of made it out into collections subsequently. And yeah, so I didn't take that as gospel, but some of the pieces wouldn't have attracted as much interest to have been monkeyed around with. And again, how do I say this? The damage that I saw on it was consistent enough with more solidly provenanced pieces for it not to raise alarm bells with me going, hang on a second, someone who doesn't know what they're doing was just playing with this. The groupings were consistent enough for me not to necessarily for it not to be so wildly anomalous for me to dismiss it outright, if that makes sense.
And Turkish bureaucracy.
Yes, quite.
Yes, definitely.
I got close, and this is one of the kind of a classic one that got away story because during my time back in Boston, I worked as an admin for a lab at one of the universities where the chief researcher was Turkish, and so were quite a lot of the scientists there, and I had an in where somebody's friend's uncle was a retired colonel in the Turkish military, and they were going to put a word in for me. And so it's like I was almost going to kind of get the letter of introduction that may have allowed me to go to the military museum to see the stuff. And that's just when there was that, not coup, but there was that big kind of reshuffle. And a lot of military personnel were scrubbed, and there was a big kind of upending of the kind of bureaucracy. And at that point, I lost contact with the guy, and it's like, nope, not going to happen. So,
friends in high places can quickly
be not so high.
Yeah. In terms of, a lot of damage to a lot of weapons, and it seems like the fact that even now that you're mentioning the blades on ceremonial swords also damaged, so there's a lot of reuse and keeping these weapons. In your experience, how much damage could a sword or a blade take before it needed to be like scrapped? Or have you what's the window of usability, let's say, of a sword you've found?
Ooh, well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, as with anything, there won't be a hard and fast rule, but I can speak to this both from what I examined in my research and also from my experience as a curator dealing with collections and as a medievalist kind of reading about things. It's very much a kind of waste not attitude in a way that we as a throwaway culture today aren't accustomed to. The blades, quite a lot of blades that I examined had an astonishing amount of damage to them. Some of which that was maintained and reduced to kind of keep it going, some of which wasn't. And so like the idea that some of these swords and other weapons that were used continually with not as much maintenance as you would expect, either because they didn't get around to it, either because it wasn't necessary, didn't actually compromise the blade the way we might have been afraid of. So like some of these things were really banged up and still showed signs of being actively used. And then there's plenty of instances of repairs, like the number of times where I would see a blade profile where it'd be straight, and suddenly the line of the edge would kind of go, where you could tell, oh, so that's a lot of either sharpening or grinding down the edge to get rid of it. And consistently, so the number of times that I found blades that didn't actually have any nicks in it, but you look at the profile of the edge and it's because of maintenance. So it's like, okay, this is someone used this quite a while, and this is quite a lot of repair. And in my experience, if a blade was too knackered to be used as a sword, you could repurpose it and grind it down into a dagger.
Exactly.
I've found plenty of cases of that. There's an amazing piece up at the Armories in Leeds in the Self-Defense Gallery, if it's still there. It's been a while since I've been there, where it was a longer single-handed, like an arming sword, that snapped, and rather than just chucking it, they ground down the back edge into a blunt spine and basically turned it into a shortened kind of messer falchion shaped thing. But it's atrocious. It's really, really messy looking, but you could just tell that they just kind of sharpened an edge, kind of sharpened a curve, sharpened a bit of the back edge, and then ground down the backs to make a spine. And it was like, yep, still works. Off you go. And so absolutely, if mind you, that's for the kind of people that couldn't afford, just to kind of go,
Yeah.
you know, I didn't see any of Maximilian's stuff recycled. It's just,
Well, it's
not to
also
say it
interesting.
wasn't, because
Yeah.
again, up in Leeds, you saw plenty of the Royal Armours that earlier elements were recycled into later elements and stuff. So even people that made use of stuff and recycled. So that principle, I think, was very much there.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that that's changed in the last century, I think, because you even see on First World War era swords, you see some shortened versions that are turned into like trench knives or daggers, and that's like, oh, it's just an officer's.
I'm part of a living history group that portrays the First World War as well.
Oh, okay, so
yeah,
yeah.
I have a bayonet that had been ground down into a trench knife,
Yeah.
and things like that. Yeah, so I think before mass production consumer culture became a thing, which, as you say, it's in, for some people, it's in living memory. We're talking about a phenomena that is historically very recent, 80 years or so, that throwaway culture kind of started to gain ground. Before that, people used stuff until it just fell apart, and you couldn't recycle it into anything else anymore.
Yeah.
And that's definitely the case with something as expensive as weapons and armor.
Yeah, so here we have Elmsley again. To stick to my tinfoil hat for a second with regards to the waste not, and I suspect there was a thriving industry in the recycling of somewhat obsolete arms in the re-export to regions.
And there's material evidence.
Continues. Where the newest fashions aren't so pressing, particularly Hiberno-Irish arms and possibly in Iceland.
Absolutely. There's material evidence for this. There's a breastplate up in the armories at Leeds from the 17th century, so kind of English Civil Wars era. And it's one of those heavy, allegedly shockproof breastplates that were worn by cavalry. And when they did X-rays on it, they discovered that what this actually was a slightly less robust 17th century breastplate. In the middle, a really, really wrecked and just practically destroyed 15th century breastplate. And then another 17th century one that had just been sandwiched together and reforged to make a really, really heavy shockproof breastplate. So it's clear that they were just grabbing bits that were still around, being like, right, can this be salvaged somehow? Yep. There's the famous in the Tower of London. There's a helmet that was made into a cooking pot that's kind of got a gang hanging from it.
Exactly.
So yeah, absolutely. So it's you either cannibalize it for something better, or you sell it to people that can't afford the state-of-the-art stuff.
Last week I had a chat with Maxime Chouinard about Irish swords. We did talk about routes of importing weapons. The issue, though, of them being potentially old or obsolete didn't come up, but I'll have to check in with him too.
And then there was a thriving trade for older, out-of-date German-made blades making their way to places like North Africa.
Exactly. Yeah.
You have cascaras that were made in the 19th
Yeah.
century that have 15th century blades on them. They're rare,
Yeah.
but you see this kind of beautiful North African hilt and the running wolf mark on the blade.
Yeah. Yeah. A more complex world than we allow ourselves to think sometimes. In terms of repairs, are there some that you see more than others? Like you mentioned, the like flattening of like the pressing out of nicks or dings. Is there any other kind of repair that you commonly see, and you're like, oh, okay, I see a pattern here?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the two types of repairs that showed up the most was either kind of grinding down the edges entirely, and this either could have been over time, either through resharpening or to
Hmm.
grind down nicks, and that just affects the profile of the blade over time. Other times you would see where a notch in the blade would be rounded, and that's almost certainly, and I got some really cool verification from this from modern practitioners who work with live edges. And they say, yeah, we absolutely do this. We grind down the triangular notches into round ones because then there's no longer part that could cause the blade to fracture more from that point. And so I saw that loads and loads of times. So that was definitely more common, to kind of round out notches so that there's still a notch in the blade, but it's no longer a weak spot that could cause the blade to snap from that point.
Yeah.
So those were, I think, the two most common. Or if a notch caused a burr, you grind off and smooth out the burr. So you'd still see kind of notches that bit into the edge at wonky angles, but
Yeah.
they were smoothed out along the profile so that it wasn't something that was going to catch anymore. But
Have you ever
occasionally I
seen?
saw some really weird repairs. Like
Oh, nice.
Paris. There's one in Paris where it was an early 15th century longsword, where the tip snapped off,
Hmm.
and they just created a notch and joint and soldered it back into place. And I looked
That's
at that, I was like, that can't be very, very strong, but someone was just determined to do it, and it's still there.
yeah,
Like
that's
ugly,
just
but
what I
it's
was
still
about to
there.
ask now about snapped blades, because you do see sometimes some repairs of the times. I've seen some on more recent ones actually, or I've heard about repairs being done. So obviously they're maybe not as weak as we think, or so I was curious to see. And
I mean, that person clearly seemed to think so.
yeah,
Enough to, 600-year-old welds are not going to stand now. So it probably would have held out for a while. But and again, when I say tip, I'm talking about like the top like 3-4 inches of the blade was re-welded on.
yeah,
So maybe that's not going to take the same amount of abuse. So they would have trusted it for that for a while. It would have maybe bought them a bit of time. But then again, it also says something that it's still there all after time. I think in my experience, a lot of times I've found more signs that if something like, the tip snapped off, they would have simply ground down the edge and made that the new tip and not
yeah,
touch
yeah.
it.
That I would think
Just get
that
shortened.
would be exactly. Okay, so I have one question now. In the meantime, I'll call for questions. So if anyone has anything they want to ask, I won't keep you too long still.
Oh, no, that's fine.
So this is your moment to ask your questions. But one question I have is about damage to hilts. So is it something you've observed or you've studied, and is there any learnings we can take from that?
Yeah. Some, not a great deal, but then again, with the ease with which hilt furniture can be switched out, that's maybe not entirely surprising.
Mm.
But I did find some notches that in the hilt that did suggest that, receiving a stroke and letting it receiving a stroke with using the hilt as as a supplement for a defensive
Mm-hmm.
mechanism, or or that your opponent kind of snapped down as you were making an offensive maneuver, and that their edge caught onto yours in the process of that something like that was happening. I did find a few instances of that. Mainly it's interesting with weapons that were made for use of two hands rather than one, which is
Okay.
also interesting because you have Jeffrey Forgang's theory, when he published his Lecoqner translation, saying that, in his opinion, this Messer treatise is a pretty good standard for the way that, any single-handed weapon could be used, single or double-edged.
Mm-hmm.
That seemed to hold some water because I found far less hilt damage to single-edged weapons than I did for say, hand and a half long swords and so on that are made for two-handed use as well. So does that suggest the possibility that single-handed use wasn't as keen on trying to catch make use of the hilt, except as a backup, as a defensive mechanism? Maybe, I don't know. Again, didn't see enough to make a definitive conclusion on that. But yes, I did find some dings to hilts that suggest that at some point an edge came down and whacked the hilt.
And based on what you've been saying so far, like imperial weapons, like emperor's weapons, which are damaged, ceremonial weapons, which are damaged. Is the majority of weapons you've observed damaged, or is the majority of what survived? Because I think a lot of people visiting a museum maybe have the impression that, oh, a lot of this is more like fancy display stuff. That's how it survived, let's say. And but from what I'm hearing so far, it seems like instead a lot of the stuff is observably used.
Yeah. I would say, again, I have my limits in far as like time and resources of the collections that I visited and such. And in some places I had limits as to what I could get my hands on. But, I examined, I don't even, I didn't keep track of the number of weapons that I examined, but out of all of the collections that I visited and the hundreds upon hundreds, I'm going to say easily hundreds upon hundreds, if not close to 1,000 plus weapons that I examined I believe, if memory serves, for the thesis, I documented somewhere around, I want to say, if you look at the little summary that I wrote, it'll be there, the exact number, but I want to say it's around 150 or so, somewhere between 150 and 200, with damage that fit my criteria for examining. Now, so in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot when you consider just how much stuff is in collections. But, there's the two main reasons that could explain that is, one, it could be a testament that during these weapons' working lives, they were well maintained to the point where notches and stuff just aren't in evidence anymore. But the other, which just kind of gives me nightmares, is that unfortunately, 18th and 19th century collectors and curators were a bit more, shall we say, aggressive in their conservation than we would think would be a good practice today. There are plenty of cases of early collectors grinding the blades and hilts of their weapons to make them look prettier for display. Even Oakeshott talks about, there's a story about him, because he knew everybody back in his day, paying a visit to the person in charge of the collection at the Westminster Abbey, and sitting in a church pew cleaning some of Henry V's funerary achievements. So cleaning Henry V's funerary sword with wire wool. It's like, and so it's like, but it was the culture of the times, what they did.
Yeah.
So have to account that a lot of this could have just been from aggressive maintenance more recently as well. There's any number of reasons that what I found was as small in population as it was. So that's one of the reasons I always said, it's like, by statisticians' definitions, what I found wasn't statistically significant out there, but it was enough to kind of say, you can look at this and just notice that there are patterns that are observable in the amount of stuff that I examined.
And circling back to the, let's say, connection with practice, let's say in modern practice, and at risk of pissing off some people who really, but my question is going to be, considering that the damage seems to be distributed very evenly across swords in different museums from different provenances, from different regions and everything, does this maybe suggest that the style of fighting was actually not as important as we tend to think today, and that, yeah, you kind of learn what is your regional style, but other than that, they all kind of converge into a sort of average use? Or is this blasphemy?
Oh boy. Okay. So the last time I really kicked a hornet's nest in the HEMA community was when I published a brief article online saying that I think it is unhelpful to think in terms of regional styles. I know that there are plenty of people that just use it as a shorthand to talk about kind of German style, Italian style, and everything like that. But there are some people that seem to me to kind of hold to that more and actually think that there are kind of characteristics of, that are characteristically Germanic or Italian. And I don't personally think that that's a terribly helpful way to think about it. I much preferred thinking about it in terms of individual masters and individual treatises, because even within what we like to call, for example, the Lichtenauer tradition, you've got some variance between certain masters that emphasize this aspect of it or de-emphasize that, or do little bits that kind of pollinate it with their own thing that's kind of distinctly them. So I've always reckoned in terms of this master and this master, or this treatise even, or that treatise, because even from their own mouths, you talk about the famous prologue we have about Lichtenauer, that he traveled in many lands and learned from many masters. So he probably wouldn't have even considered himself a German master, except for the fact that he was a master and he happens to be Germanic. And likewise, you get much the same story from what little we know about Fiore. He traveled and learned with many masters. And when you think about, how culturally all over the map Italy was at that point,
exactly,
he would have gotten stuff from everywhere. And you look at martial artists today, like how often do martial artists hang out and just trade war stories, and you're like, oh, you do Kung Fu, I do Taekwondo, hey, let's try it. Like, oh, you do this, oh, it's cool. And so it's like when living martial artists hang out, they cross-pollinate. It's inevitable. It's always going to happen. And so I think by the time you get that happening we've seen that happening for, the time that we've been studying HEMA, let alone 500-600 years of that sort of thing. And so for me, just kind of relying on regional identities to try to kind of put a regional label or a cultural label even on a style of combat or principles, I'm not saying it's wrong, I just don't find it helpful. It's like scholars roll their eyes when we read about, Vegetius everyone that plagiarized Vegetius, like Machiavelli, and everyone that kind of wrote, military strategy handbooks, they all had their standard issue section on, now we're going to talk about the style of fighting that the English do, and the Italians, they are robust and fiery people, so they tend to fight in this way. And nowadays you look at them being like, this is so painting with such a broad brush. And it's this, for me, I lump the tendency to kind of paint regional styles with that same phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Polarize it, Vegeti is doing that, so why would we do it?
True.
So I wrote a brief little article, not being very aggressive about it, was saying like, hey, maybe we should start thinking this in terms of masters and treatises instead of German style, and get over this kind of German versus Italian kind of beef that people love to have. And the amount of comments that people have getting really, really angry about this was startling. I mean, it was the most viewed and most commented thing I ever wrote. But
that is the recipe for success.
It's just it's internet success in that it got the most attention, but for all the wrong reasons.
And well, at least someone agrees with you here, because Sword Science and Historical Fencing says this is why I belong to a style agnostic club. We take the stuff that works from anywhere.
I mean, I'm going to commit heresy here in saying, like, and this again, big gleaming disclaimer. This is my practice and my own. I don't consider this to be historically true. This is just my approach. I merge, like, for me, the way that Fiore's treatises are structured makes it a wonderful introductory, bare bones kind of foundational system to work from, and that you have a system of basic guards and cuts in a way that seems to me to be more, it's not to downplay it, but more kind of, you can take that and make that a really good kind of beginner's standpoint, because it's much more comprehensive. And then once you're comfortable with that, then you can add in what they call the master strokes, because they're a little bit more advanced. They're a little bit more counterintuitive. So the idea of it being kind of okay, comfortable with how to actually swing this thing around in a more kind of intuitive way. Now let's do some fancy stuff. And then you can bring in Lichtenauer et al.'s work with that. And I find the two marry quite nicely. And, in this day and age, for people to say, oh, I don't trust that, I don't touch that Italian stuff, or I don't touch that German stuff. It's like, well, then you're missing out on a massive swath on what is already an incredibly limited body of material that we're working with. So you're missing out.
Okay, and here we have some disagreement, at least for as far as beginners go. Chris Morgan, the agnostic approach doesn't help with teaching beginners.
Okay, I mean,
I don't teach anyone.
I'd love to have dialogue about this, because are you implying that sticking with one particular system is just easy for consistency's sake, or I find that an interesting comment, and I'd love to learn more about it.
Okay, so while we wait for Chris, if you want to expand on that, this is your chance, because we're in the last minute. I'll just ask you quickly, James, in the meantime,
Sure.
Do you have follow-up on your research planned? Is it something that you feel you want to bring somewhere to a further step, or do you consider that for now a chapter that's written?
Two children and kind of working in a career that's not given to research as part of the job description does a wonderful job of just kind of pulling you off of the ability to spend hours and hours at a time with your research as is necessary to do work of this. Saying that, I've not given up. I still try to keep interested and keep abreast of these things as best I can. I am determined that when my slack increases again, that I would love to go back to this. I am determined that my thesis will be published one day in a book and will see the light of day. When that is, who knows? Like, I'm not going to lose sleep over trying to force it through at the expense of my life as it is.
Makes sense.
I still have the bug for this stuff. It's still a passion. I still get involved with it where I can. And so I will continue to spit out bits of research as and when I am able, but how frequent that is at this point is anybody's guess.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, priorities doesn't make sense. Although Elmsley is publication before death,
Before death, yeah.
that's a good.
And it's not. I'll make provisions for it to be posthumous.
And yes, if it's posthumous, it's not your problem any longer. True. And speaking of the training aspect, Chris hasn't answered yet, but Sword Science and Historical Fencing mentions that they generally start beginners with KDF, guards, and strikes. That seems to be a decent foundation. I mean, to me, from the outside, as a person who's actually learning, the idea that you kind of have a bit of a closed environment you can start focusing on doesn't sound insane, but I also don't see why it would be that much more difficult to learn a more like out of the system approach. Like,
yeah, I mean, I'm not a good example of a systematic approach to this stuff. Just given where I come, so I mean, I'm the last person you would ask for that. I mean, these days when I teach, in addition to kind of drawing useful principles from the various masters, my kind of structural approach of how I structure my lessons comes from my time as a fight choreographer teaching stage combat. And I take at least the principles of how I used to teach people stage fighting, but I apply, the historical techniques to that, because that's how I cut my teeth, teaching people how to do stage fighting. So it's what's comfortable to me. But I can absolutely imagine that someone that got their start with the more historical techniques will pass that on in the way that they received it. I got this stuff from a really weird way. Like I was taught stage combat from someone who was a Chinese martial arts practitioner. So I was trained with Chinese conditioning drills to get my body up for it, and kind of sword drills in order to get comfortable with it. And then I was taught stage combat, but also taught actual fighting by sparring to get comfortable so that you could make the stage combat convincing and informative. So I get this really weird mishmash cocktail for this stuff. And as a result, that's made me this weird Frankenstein's monster of my approach to the stuff that it is. So I am not a purebred by any stretch of the imagination when it comes to this.
We did get a reply from Chris, so they teach, raw earth, and I tell the beginners that the stuff out of the manual is the bare tree trunk and limbs. Once mastered, they can then populate the tree with leaves. So add their own
that's
stuff.
a good approach. I can understand that. It's you got to learn. You got to learn the melody before you can play it like jazz. I definitely get that.
Also, when things aren't going well, they can always revert back to the manual basics. For me, as a total beginner, this feels like the safe place I can go. You can go to your manual and be, okay, I'll find my answers hopefully there. Okay, cool. So I think I'll let you get back to your family duties. But for everyone, while we wait for James's thesis to be published, he has a Patreon on which all of his, or a lot of your stuff is like available articles and things are published. So do you want to?
Basically, I used to have a couple of websites where I put various stuff. And so I cobbled together all in a Patreon, but I made it a rule that everything that's existed someplace else before is on there for free. So you don't have to pay me to get access to that stuff. There's some stuff that I put behind a paywall that's kind of newer work, but everything that's existed before, in the interest of, if you got good Google Foo, you'll find it's in original places, but in the interest of putting it all together, I put it there and you can still see it for free. And so I've got YouTube videos of some of my lectures and articles and stuff. So if you're interested in this stuff, that's where it lives currently in a contained environment.
And it's linked in the video description. So if you're curious, and you should be, go check it out, and you'll learn a lot. So thank you, James. It was a really, really interesting conversation. I really hope to see the published work someday.
So do I.
For your own satisfaction, but for my own learning too.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. It's been, I get fewer opportunities these days to have proper geek sessions about this stuff. So this was great. Thank you for having me.
Nice. We have one more last comment by Chris, just to close. P.S. He notices many cavalry sabers are bent. I presume from training and failing to extract the blade cleanly from the dummy.
That would certainly be the case for the First World War ones that I've handled, because it was a very, very kind of precise method in order to do that at speed and extract it. So yeah, kind of 19th and early 20th century cavalry sabers. I would definitely buy that theory, because that has been my experience from the ones I've examined. If it didn't rip it sword out of your hand or take you out of your horse in the process.
I'd rather have a bent blade than than be dragged off my horse.
Yeah.
Okay, so again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining in. And we'll see you soon in another conversation. Maybe James, you're always welcome, of course. I feel like there's a lot of stuff we could have still talked about.
I'd be happy to do this again if you can find another topic to drag out.
Perfect, absolutely. Okay, have a nice evening then. Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye.